I want to welcome everybody to our Interfaith Council. And tonight we're presenting our next virtual open house for July, our faith and spirituality. And tonight we welcome the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints to talk a bit and answer questions. And we have for this talk, President Dave Simmons. So President Simmons was born and raised in and around Salt Lake City, Utah. Lifelong member of the church. At the age of 19, he served a 2-year church mission in Belgium and northern France. He's married with 4 children and 6 grandchildren. His family spent 15 years living in the Bay Area and then moved to Southern California. So he's lived in Simi Valley since 2003. President Stevens currently serves as the first counselor in the Simi Valley stake, which is comprised of 9 congregations and just under 3,000 total members. Wow. So welcome, President Stevens.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to this. We don't get to see faces on this, but I know a few years ago at one of the Thanksgiving interfaith meetings, I was there and met, I'm sure some of you, saw some of you and said a few words. So I'm pleased to have an opportunity. I've tried to think of the best approach here to help you understand our faith, and we'll see how it goes. I've got a few different ideas in the way I'm going to present it, but I'll do this with the help of some PowerPoint slides. So let me bring that up. All right, hopefully everyone's able to see that. Phyllis, you can see that, we're fine? Okay, all right. Well, first off is, we're referred to in a number of ways, and I'm not sure that everyone knows the real name of the church. Mormons is often the description that's used to refer to us, and I'm going to give you a little background on that. But the name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Not the simplest or shortest name to use, and doesn't lend itself, I think, to saying that every time a member, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I think that's why in some instances it is referred to in short as Latter-day Saints. I'll talk a little bit about the concept of why that is part of the name. Others may know us as LDS, which of course is just the acronym of Latter-day Saints. LDS members, LDS Church is often a description that you hear. And then perhaps most frequently or commonly outside of the church, the reference is to the Mormons. And there's a reason behind that. So let me give you just a little bit of background about the church. And then I want to get into, a little bit of who we are, what we value in life, how you would recognize us as your neighbors, the kinds of attributes that you would see in members of the church, and we'll kind of follow that path here. So the church's organization is back in 1830, and the first prophet of our church was a young man named Joseph Smith. We consider him to be a prophet, and I'll describe a little bit of what that means to us. So one of the first things that Joseph Smith did was he translated an ancient record of people that had resided in the Americas. And that translation included a number of prophets' writings of a civilization that lived on the on North and South America back before Christ, and then subsequently for a number of years after that. But the book, covers a period of about 1,000 years of prophetic writings of initially a prophet who left Jerusalem and traveled with his family across the sea, and that's where that began. The last prophet that wrote in that book was named Mormon. So the book carries that title, and actually that became a Broadway show, not produced by the church, but we have fun laughing at ourselves too. When others take a perspective, maybe a satirical perspective at times, but it's the book that was translated by Joseph Smith that bore that name, and from early time in the church that became the descriptor. As I said, it's a little easier than the full name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph was killed in the summer of 1844 at the young age of 38. He had about 14 years from the time the church was formed in 1830 until he was killed in 1844 to lay the foundations of the church. Those who martyred Joseph had thought that would be the end of his followers. Joseph was, I'm sure, charismatic. I'm sure that he drew people to him, but I think what I'd like to describe in some of the details of the elements of our worship and the doctrine of the church, it was not his personality that exclusively brought congregations in and developed the church. It was the doctrines and what that became. So in that period of time, since 1844, the church now has actually 16.5 million members in 185 nations and territories. Now, there were many writings of Joseph Smith that we consider to be scripture. There's a history that we're studying right now in our church study. We will move through different books of scripture in a year's course of study. So the Old Testament, the New Testament, we're studying this year writings of Joseph, revelations that we believe he received that has the name, the Doctrine and Covenants. And in that Doctrine and Covenants, in a portion there is what we call the Articles of Faith. And Joseph was asked before he died, he was asked by someone what the church believed from a politician in Chicago, and he penned these Articles of Faith, which we all as youth will learn and memorize and recite, but they're a very succinct characterization of the tenets of the church. And I'm not going to necessarily read through those, but in the course of the description, I might reference that this particular tenet of our church is one of these 13 Articles of Faith. So let's get to the story behind the church's name, the longer name. There was actually in these revelations that Joseph Smith compiled, one of those revelations gave him the name of the Church of Jesus Christ. And it was, we believe, Christ's revealing to Joseph that if this was to be his church, it should bear his name. The Latter-day Saints phrase, we use the term saints not in a revered sense of someone that's been sainted or deemed, to be kind of at another level. It's saints was a reference to the followers, the believers of Christ. We refer often to ourselves, one another, as the saints, and so Latter-day Saints distinguishes us from the original church, the members of the original church that Jesus Christ formed before his crucifixion. So hence we sometimes are called LDS, Latter-day Saints, but that's just a little bit of the background surrounding the name and why people call us sometimes things other than members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So Among the tenets that I want to touch on, one of them is that we have respect for laws. We believe in law and order. We believe in being obedient to the laws. That's not, wildly unusual. I'm just saying that, that's one of these 13 articles of faith is honoring and obeying the laws, whatever we're subject to in the countries that we live in. But another one of those tenets is what we would think of as freedom to worship. And we believe strongly in that. It's that we believe we have the right and everyone else has the right to worship in the articles of faith. It refers to how, where, or what they may. And we honor other people's rights to worship and respect others' opinions and share our opinions and like to have those dialogues. We've been involved for a long time in the Interfaith Council. Enjoy and appreciate working with others of faith and sharing thoughts and views and doing good in the world in general. So we're certainly big advocates of First Amendment rights for freedom of worship. We don't like feeling contraction around that ability to worship. We've seen a little bit of that with the COVID protocols and the lockdowns. And we aren't, it's not our nature to press the limits or to engage in civil disobedience. We would follow the laws and pursue actions that might help through the laws to relieve what we may think is our constraints. The church itself, headquarters is based in Salt Lake City, has means and ability to bring lawsuits, as many organizations did, particularly in California. We watched with interest those proceedings. There were members of the church on law firms that were part of those proceedings, but the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints didn't initiate a particular suit that led to the Supreme Court. Although I'm aware of an individual that did sit on the Catholic Diocese Supreme Court as the second chair, who happens to be a stake president in a stake in Southern California, and he argued that case successfully that brought us the freedoms that we had hoped to receive and to be able to gather again. So we're grateful for that. I wanted to talk about our perspective with some other faiths. We have a strong alliance and respect for and common elements of our tenets with those of the Jewish faith. We, as I said before, we believe the Bible to be the Word of God. I know some people, because we choose to embrace additional scripture that we think God has spoken to other peoples, and that we will embrace those as well. We do not, belittle the Bible and say, we believe it to be the Word of God. And when we read the Old Testament, we don't see it as a metaphorical account. We see it as a literal account with ancient religious experiences and prophetic revelations, some of which we see coming true today in what we'd call signs of the times. We believe that the 12 tribes were long ago scattered, and as the North and South kingdoms back in the records in the Old Testament, and what is described as the lost 10 tribes, we believe there will be a gathering again of those lost 10 tribes. And that's actually, again, another one of the tenets in the Article of Faith. By no means anything like the Holocaust, but in our early church history, members faced severe persecution, even leading up to the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, as he had been put in jail on some charges that were basically had not much basis, as we would describe. But anyway, he did his dutifully. He went and submitted himself for what may come of that, and he was killed in that that jail. The members of the church that lived in the Midwest were eventually driven out of their homes, and that led to the migration west, the pioneers that came across in covered wagons. Some came in hand carts, thousands and thousands that ultimately settled in Salt Lake City, and actually proceeded to settle in many western areas, states, and some of the cities that were settled by some of the very early members of our church. I mentioned that we recognize some signs of the time today. We see a significance in the gathering of the Jews to their ancestral lands as a prophetic fulfillment of events in the last days. We recognize, interesting timing. The embassy moving to Jerusalem 70 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence of Israel is, not lost on us. Kind of the significance of numerology and how important that is in some of the faiths, particularly Jewish faith. I personally, and I know other members kind of watch with keen interest what transpires in Jerusalem in terms of discussion about the rebuilding of the temple. Kind of find now and then looking at the templeinstitute.org site, which is characterizing progress along that front, and that's interesting to us because we definitely see that as a prophetic fulfillment. We are a temple building people. As members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we currently have 168 temples around the world in 71 different countries and 84 more under construction. They seem to be growing at an exponential rate. Originally, they were much larger. The temple in Salt Lake City that many probably have seen images of, it's sort of representative of anything that's broadcast from Salt Lake sport events or whatever. It seems to, focus in on the temple and aspires. There's a temple on Santa Monica Boulevard, which we call the Los Angeles Temple, again, of the larger size of temples, but more now the temples that are being built would look more the size of one of our chapels, our congregational weekly meeting houses. They're built smaller so that they can be distributed closer to members of the church rather than focusing on large temples that would require people to travel. I put the phrase, yes, we are Christian, because there is often some debate, some characterization that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints aren't really Christian. And I don't want to, get into details of some of the specifics, but there's some interpretations of doctrine that we have that maybe don't align 100% in terms of the way some other Christians see things, in terms of the Godhead, as an example. But I will just say that Christ is absolutely the center of our worship. You won't see crosses on our buildings or in our chapels. That's not disrespect to those that choose to do that, but it's our sense is that we're focused more on Christ after his crucifixion and the resurrection and what that means, and worship the living Christ, if you will. But we don't typically have those kinds of symbols in our chapels, nor really pictures in the main chapels. They're more simple. We consider the accounts of the Christ ministry in the New Testament to be absolutely historical, truthful. The miracles he performed. We believe that Jesus was born of a Virgin Mary, was the only begotten Son in the flesh of God the Father. We believe that he is the Messiah that was foretold in the Old Testament, and look forward to his prophesied return or second coming, when he will restore peace to the earth. And we see that, again, our phrase Latter-day Saints, we see that even more and more evident, we think, in the signs around us in terms of what's going on in the world, that event certainly is getting closer. We believe that the suffering in Gethsemane and the death on the cross of Calvary opened the gates for forgiveness, salvation, and the resurrection of all mankind. Finally, we believe in this is another one of the tenets from the Articles of Faith. We believe in the same organization that existed originally that Christ created, including prophets, 12 living apostles, and the 70 that were sent 2 by 2 to preach. So I thought maybe the best way to characterize that is a visual of our church organization. I don't want to get too down into the details of this, but want to make a couple observations about this. I know I was introduced by Phyllis as being a counselor in a stake presidency. A lot of the way the church is organized and runs as in councils. We have councils, we counsel together, decisions are made. We look for unanimity in terms of agreement once something is discussed and proposed, and ultimately the president in an organization would make a final decision, and then it's expected that others would support that. And we often do that by a raise of the hand. We do sustainings in the church. Things are presented, we raise and show our support for that. And by raising the hand, then we indicate we're going to follow and help that process succeed if it's an activity or it's some kind of thing that we need to be involved with. So the prophet of our church is Russell M. Nelson. He is he's an accomplished man. He's a renowned heart surgeon, wonderful, loving prophet, and he rose to that position when the prior prophet, Thomas Monson, passed away. Russell M. Nelson was the senior apostle, and that's how the progression of the church occurs. So he has 2 counselors. The prophet and his 2 counselors we refer to as the first presidency. The first presidency works with 12 apostles. That group of the first presidency and the quorum of the 12 are the decision-making body that makes decisions, works on implementation of the gospel, and calls missionaries. It comes from the apostles and from the president of the church. When one of our young men or women decide to go out and serve a mission, which I'll touch on a little bit, it's a call that comes and is endorsed by the president of the church. When that call comes and a letter comes, now it comes electronically, but when I served, it was a letter that came in the mail, and you'd open it up and you'd find out where you were going. So that's the leading body. That's the president, his counselors, and the apostles. Those 15 men guide and direct the church. Underneath them are what we call area presidencies, and these are 70s, which again in the scriptures tended to be focused on doing missionary work, being out in the world. Those 70s have a group of presidencies, 22 of them all across the world, and so they oversee geographic areas. We reside in what's called the North America West area, and that includes California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, and all the members of the church then are under that area presidency. Underneath them, at smaller groupings, are area authorities. Everything in white below the 70s is volunteer. Everybody in the church below what we call general authorities, who are called on a full-time basis to serve in a calling as an apostle or as a 70, they're obviously supported by the church. The rest are volunteer, and it's part-time. So an area authority, our area authority, oversees 8 different stakes. So underneath an area authority is a stake president. Simi Valley, usually it's a geographic area. Thousand Oaks and Moore Park is another stake in the area. Agora, Westlake, and Newberry Park is a third stake. Then if you go down over the grade into Camarillo, there's another one in Camarillo, Ventura, Santa Barbara. So these are stakes. Underneath, and I'm the first counselor to Richard Anderson, who is the stake president. Because these are voluntary positions, you are called by someone in authority above you, and you serve for a time. Bishops generally will serve in that position. They oversee a ward, which is a congregation. So you might have 300 to 400 members of the church. in a unit that we call a ward. You'll have a bishop, he has 2 counselors. Those three men lead that organization, and they may serve for 5 years, 6 years. It's not always just on an exact time. A stake presidency typically serves for about 9 years. I show to the side of the stake president box what we call the High Council. A High Council consists of 12 men. They're not called apostles, but they're called High Councilmen. And so we make our decisions in the stake based on the 15 of us, the 3 in the stake presidency and the 12 in the High Council. Down again below the bishops inside a ward, where you may have 300-400 members, it's divided into the brothers, as we call them, the men, in an elders quorum, and there's a president over that with 2 counselors. And the women's side is, we call it the Relief Society. And the Relief Society has 2 counselors. And so their job is to oversee the flock, if you will, and the members. Another thing about our organization in the church is that we look after one another. So amongst all the men in the church, the women in the church, they're often assigned 2 or 3 other individuals or families that they're to minister to, they're to look after. So part of the, Joseph Smith, when asked how the church was guided, he said, "I teach correct principles and they govern themselves." Part of the organization, given that it's a lay organization, we don't go to attain degrees in order to be leaders. We have to learn. It's on the job learning. And so you serve in different capacities. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about the youth and how they lead in some of their own activities. But we try to teach leadership in very early stages, so it's a comfortable thing for people when they're thrust into a position of leadership. Often when somebody's called, it's by inspiration. We have just recently, out of 9 units in Simi Valley wards, we have recently replaced 3 of the bishops. And they didn't know it was coming. They didn't ask for it. We sought prayer and inspiration and identified 3 men in those 3 wards over the past 6 to 8 weeks. And we went through a process of interviewing them, as we say, calling them, asking them, would they be willing to serve? And they accept those callings, and then we present them to their congregation. And everyone, as I said, has an opportunity to sustain them or object. If they have an objection, which I've rarely if ever seen, but if somebody had an objection, they would come talk to someone conducting outside and say, here's my objection. If it's just a personal objection, then you'd probably talk through that. If there was something about worthiness that they were aware of that someone wasn't aware of, then it would become a discussion, and it would be, there would be some insight into that and some discussion. So anyway, that is how the organization is built and runs. I thought I would take an approach at saying there are many of us in Simi Valley, in and around you as neighbors, and I just wanted to give you some of the core values that we have, and maybe explain why we do things that we do, and that you will look at that and understand. Now, that's why they seem very unfriendly on Sundays, for example. I'll talk about honoring the Sabbath day, but first, families. And I came across some statistics that I've just kind of interspersed here as sort of interesting outsiders' view of some of the tenets of our faith that sort of gives a perspective to that, and how we live our lives, and how it's a little bit different perhaps than some other religions may approach things. So just families are fundamental. I think people tend to think of LDS families as having more kids than the average, if you're familiar with this. So a Pew report in 2008 said that 67% of LDS adults are married, and that's actually 15% higher than the national average. 73% of adults believe that successful marriage is one of the most important things that we can do in life, and that's compared to an overall US average of 34% in a study that across the US that was whether they thought marriage was one of the most important things. We may also be known by some of you for the code of health. So long ago, Joseph Smith, in observing one of the councils they were having, some of the men there in that meeting were spitting tobacco on the floor. And his wife had commented on how disgusting that was. Anyway, he then sought guidance in prayer, which is the fashion of which he received revelation. And he received what we call the word of wisdom. So back in the 1830s, before some of these things were necessarily viewed, now a little bit more prominently, tobacco, for example, you see a lot of commercials to avoid that. But that was part of the very early tenets, and it was counsel in the early days. Ultimately, it's become part of as I'll get to in a moment, our temples. To attend a temple, you have to be of a certain worthiness standard, and obeying this word of wisdom is one of those questions. It's certainly not a premise to have you removed from the church or whatever, and many members interpret the word of wisdom a little bit differently, but there is a certain standard that you'd be asked if you plan to go to the temple and, for example, be married in the temple. You would need to respond positively to following that commandment. So, what has that done for the church members? UCLA did a survey that I believe was Southern California. This wasn't a US-wide, but they found that members of our women in our church had a life expectancy of 86.1 years, which is 5.5 times the US average, and men 84.1, which was 10 times the US average. Sabbath day. So we honor the Sabbath day. We believe fervently in that commandment. About half of a membership of a ward will attend the Sunday services every week. And those services last for 2 hours. They used to last 3 hours. They now are a little bit shorter. It includes the main meeting we call the sacrament meeting, and that's when the sacrament is administered and speakers will speak. And then there's a second meeting, and it depends on the week, but it's basically an instructional gathering of certain groups within the church. The youth gather, the men may gather for some instruction. Sometimes the men and women, the adults will gather for instruction. But anyway, Pew also kind of in the study of LDS or the members of the church vis-a-vis kind of the general world and out there is that a fairly high percentage of members of the church exhibit a very strong religious commitment, where in the general public, it's less than half of that percentage. We focus on time at home on Sundays. We avoid recreation, sporting events, dining out, entertainment. So if you have asked your neighbor to go golfing and it happens to be on the Sunday and he's not responding the way you would hope, it's because of our view of the Sabbath. Come back on Saturday. I'll be glad to go golfing with you if you live in the neighborhood. So next, just 3 more to talk about. We abide by a biblical tithe, 10% of our annual increase. And in addition to tithing, members may choose to donate to welfare, which goes to those in need within our ward boundaries or our state boundaries, or if we collect excess in the Simi Valley stake, those funds are delivered to church headquarters and used in other parts of the world to support members who may be on hard times and may need assistance. But there are other ways to donate. There's a perpetual education fund that goes out throughout the world that helps people who can't afford to earn their education, and that fuels that. There's missionary funds for the missionaries who go out. There was a study from the University of Pennsylvania that identified that LDS members donate 6.24% of their yearly income, which is about 5 times the amount of donations from non-religious affiliations. So anyway, it's important to us. Tithing is also part of questions. If you want to go into the temple and partake of special ordinances that occur in the temple, you would be asked if you're a full tithe payer. We believe strongly in educational attainment. Most studies have tended to indicate that the more educated people become, the less religious they may be. It seems to be just the opposite in our congregations. And so that Pew report that I referred to earlier said that if you have a college degree and exhibit a high religious commitment, about 84% of our members fell into that category from that Pew report. In contrast, high school degree or less showed only a 50% commitment. So it's a little bit opposite the general phenomenon. Finally, high level of volunteerism comes from, I think, the absence of a paid clergy. You know, people need to step up for things to function, but a typical, from a University of Pennsylvania study in 2012, typical member of our church spends about 36 hours a month volunteering, which is 9 times the US average of volunteerism. That's because we're instructing classes, we're speaking. Our speakers are not paid presenters. You know, if you're active and attending one of these wards, probably every 2 to 3 years, you're going to have a chance to speak for 25 minutes at one of the meetings, one of the congregational meetings. Our youth speak. Our youngest kids in a smaller forum, not in front of the whole congregation, will give talks when they're just barely able to read. As I said before, the church assignments kind of rotate around between the members periodically. Just some comments about the church's overall focus on humanitarianism, benevolence. A couple of the other tenets that I've been referring to are, you know, being honest, true, benevolent, chaste, virtuous. If a member is receiving assistance, which they can when they need, a bishop will determine that. Whether they need food, we have what we call a bishop storehouse that up in Sylmar that you can get a slip from a bishop and go up there and fill your grocery carts if you so need. It can be delivered to you. More and more now, it's delivered out to them rather than driving up there to get it. Sometimes you need assistance to make rent. All of that happens for the members of the church, but the focus is on long-term solutions, not long-term dependency. And so we have counseling that goes with that. We have church employment centers, social service centers to offer counseling and to offer employment advice and review of resumes and to help hook up, connect to job opportunities. The humanitarian aid program focuses on those that are not members of the church, and the church has been involved in over 200 major worldwide disasters. They're often one of the first groups in. They identify it from members of the church there that were affected. It gets communicated back to Salt Lake, and literally within hours, they're mobilized with food, water, and it's on planes and shipped out to some of these disaster areas. 100% of donations to the church goes to those humanitarian efforts that are donated to humanitarian services. And we have a program here and throughout the church that's called Just Serve, that we try and engage others in the community to identify service needs and to connect people together through an app on your phone that can help you find service opportunities. Missionary service, you may see the young men or young women around town going 2 by 2. They're always in twos. They'll serve from the ages of 18 to 25. Many couples serve after their retirement. Missionaries are paying their own way. They are not rewarded for this missionary service. And during the mission, it's not a part-time thing, it's a full-time thing. So there's no dating, and they can't continue their education. They're basically studying the scriptures and contacting people. Just a couple more thoughts here, and then we'll open for questions. Just some thoughts on the doctrinal side of things and priesthood. Throughout the ages, priesthood has been what leaders have used in conducting church affairs and performing ordinances, baptism, that sort of thing. We believe that that direct priesthood power from Jesus Christ was restored to Joseph Smith and has been passed down from that time. So all worthy men that are 18 or older are holders of the priesthood. And the priesthood would be what you would hold if you're going to be a bishop. I hold the priesthood in order to be a member of the stake presidency. They can use that priesthood to do ordinances, such as the sacrament, to baptize, and provide blessings of healing to those that may need. Young men 12 and older receive a preparatory priesthood, and they learn how to lead in their organizations. And I mentioned earlier about the Relief Society. The Relief Society is one of the world's largest and oldest women's organization. It was formed back in the time of Joseph Smith, and there's 7 million members in the Relief Society today. And they perform compassionate service and participate in gospel instruction and learning. The last slide here is just wanted to talk about what we did during COVID. Not sure how the rest of your organizations managed through that, but we dutifully complied. Our buildings were shuttered. Members were notified electronically. I will say that organizational chart I showed you, communication, you might have noticed that there aren't a lot of layers between a stake president and the president of the church. Really, from the leadership body of the Quorum of the 12, there's merely 2 levels in between, and word gets out to members very quickly. We get probably 2 or 3 emails from our church headquarters a week on information, but that word came down very quickly via phone calls, and it was disseminated through our structure in the church. And the buildings were closed, and there was no activity in the buildings. So in recent years, President Nelson, the prophet, had encouraged members to begin doing more home gospel study, and it's called Come Follow Me from the Savior. Immediately, they were instructed, instead of coming to the church building, to plan their lessons at home with families. The men who held the priesthood were authorized to administer sacrament at home to their families, which was bread and water. And once a limited number were allowed back into the buildings, we started doing Zoom broadcasts, as maybe many of you started doing. But everyone received contact from their ministering companions. It turns out a family that I'm assigned to minister to and look after in my ward, she contracted COVID very early on, and I was delivering things to the doorstep and calling them on the phone, letting them know that there was a large bag of toilet paper, which seemed to be the one thing nobody could find, and eggs, and that's how we as members look after one another. Okay, I've got 1 minute, but we'll wrap up. I didn't know if this was going to take 30 minutes or take 45 minutes, but I hope I haven't put people to sleep. But thank you for listening. And I know there's some questions that Phyllis is going to interject.
Sure. Well, thank you, President Stevens. That was a wealth of information. And yes, we have a few questions. So one of them you did touch on a bit. A person asked, you haven't talked much about families. The Mormons I know usually have families that are very important to them. Is it just the ones I know, or is that everyone?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, that question might have come before I made a little more comment on it, but one of the things I didn't mention about the temple ordinance is that we believe that marriage is not just an earthly ordinance when it's performed by the appropriate priesthood authority. And so when we go to a temple to be married, we call that a sealing of a husband and a wife. And that creates a union that children born into that union that was sealed, we believe, are part of that eternal covenant. And we believe that will endure after this life. So yes, it's not just an odd sample. It's probably a fairly representative sample, Lorraine, that what you're seeing is probably pretty universal across the church.
Wonderful. And the next question is, are women permitted or called to serve as stake or area presidents, counselors, or prophet or president. And I think that was also maybe typed in right before you had your slide.
Yeah. Let me comment on that. There are, and I brushed over that. It was that organizational slide. There were 3 organizations that I listed at the top, and I just blew by it and forgot to mention them. So the 3 organizations are, one is Relief Society, and that is led by what we call a sister. We call each other brother and sister. And so there'd be a sister or a woman who is called as a president of the Relief Society, and she serves with 2 counselors. The second organization that is headed up by what we'd call a general authority, that's a woman, is the Young Women's Organization. So the young women, they have, until they graduate high school, from 12 to 17, 18, the young women have an organization, and there's a woman who's called as the president of Young Women churchwide, and she has 2 counselors. And the final one is Primary. And Primary is an organization that is aimed at under 12-year-old, the children in the church. And that is staffed in a ward by a sister, a woman, and counselors. And so in a ward, there's 3 organizations that are mirrored: a Young Women, a Primary, and a Relief Society organization at the ward level and at the church level. But that's where women serve in presidencies, and we have the same organizations at the stake level. So it kind of ripples all the way down, those 3 same organizations of women.
Let's see, we've got some good questions here. What is the main focus of a missionary? And to piggyback on there, what did the missionaries do during COVID?
Very good question. So missionaries they're called for, the young women, the sisters, as we call the missionaries, the young women sisters, they serve for 18 months. The young men serve for 2 years. And their calling is to preach the gospel. So much of their time is teaching, contacting, working with members of the church to introduce friends of theirs to the missionaries. That's the main focus. They also carry I won't call it a quota, but they also carry a certain number of hours that they are asked to serve. And that service may be in many forms. It may be helping somebody in their backyard. It may be helping somebody move some things. But they try to do service during the day, as well as focus on sharing the message, the good word, if you will, proselyting. What did they do during COVID? They did a lot of Zoom. As soon as they could be in person, they would interact, maybe at a distance. I know that they would go to doorsteps and visit and maybe talk at doorsteps with masks on before people were comfortable having them in. But they were, as soon as they could, and as soon as someone was comfortable, they would then be out. If they had scheduled a meeting, they weren't necessarily out in the street trying to contact people, but if they had a scheduled time to go visit somebody, maybe teach them a lesson, do something, have a discussion with them, then they would go into the house.
All right. So we'll get into a little bit of theology. If you take the Bible literally, does that mean you believe the world is 6,000 years old?
The answer is yes. We believe there are 7 millennium that are associated with the time periods. And if you look at in Revelations, you look at the seals that are opened, and we believe those are representative of, we don't know that our time periods are exact to the Lord's 1,000 years, but in general, we believe that it is the world, maybe not the materials that the world was made of, but that Adam and Eve started that 6,000 year process as we head into what we believe will be the 7,000th year of the millennium.
Do you believe Jesus was a prophet?
Jesus was more than a prophet. Jesus was the Son of God, And in that role, he gave his life as an atoning sacrifice so that all who live on the earth, who have lived on the earth, will be resurrected and have an opportunity to live again with Jesus and our Father in heaven. So we look at him, we revere him in a much different fashion than a prophet. A prophet is someone that God would speak to and communicate and guide his church or his flock at a given time. But the church is Jesus Christ Church. It's his church that we abide by his commandments and his laws and his principles.
Right. If you take the Old Testament literally, then do you reject the idea of evolution? And why are there no women in leadership positions? I think upper leadership positions.
So I'm not going to take there is evolution that happens. You see it, science proves it. But I will say that we believe that Adam was the first man. We don't necessarily get into the details of how the creation of the earth happened and all of that. But so if it's a question about literal belief in Adam, we do. We believe that Adam was the first man and held a prominent role in the councils of heaven to be the first man on the earth.
And the role of women in leadership, let's say, I mean, just from even speaking on Sunday meetings on up, why are there no women in the upper roles?
There are no women as bishops. That is from Christ's revelation of his church and how it was organized before, and we followed those principles. But there are women, as I described, at the highest levels of the church organization, and they have women as counselors. All those presidencies that are Relief Society, primary, young women, they are all women presidencies.
How is the church supporting the LGBTQ members?
So there's been a lot of discussion, more focus and emphasis coming from leadership. We try not to, believe we shouldn't be judgmental of people and their decisions in the same way that we have, people who attend that aren't following all our principles. We have members of the church that don't follow the principles that would permit them to go to the temple, as an example. That doesn't mean we set them aside or we have a separate place they can sit in the chapel. So, we know people are at all stages and have different views. There are certain principles of the church that you'd have to follow to be in the temples. And one of those is chastity. So it doesn't matter whether if you're having relationships outside the bonds of a recognized marriage, that would preclude you from going to the temple. It doesn't preclude you from coming to church and participate in those kinds of activities. So regardless of what your feelings are, if you're following the rules of the gospel, you can have all the blessings and attend the temple. It doesn't matter what your inclinations are, as long as you follow by the principles of the gospel.
All right. Okay. Oh, what place does Brigham Young have in church history?
Oh, good one. Well, Brigham Young was the president of the Quorum of the 12 when Joseph Smith was martyred. And unlike today, where it takes like a day or two after the passing of a prophet to announce the new prophet, who were never surprised as the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, back in that time, it took 3 years for the church to figure out. It hadn't been really laid out by Joseph Smith how the succession was going to happen. So Brigham Young was then sustained by the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and by the membership of the church. And he played a very important role in the migration of the church from the Midwest to Salt Lake. He led that first pioneer group of 147 members. I will mention that my ancestry goes back to early church history. And one of my ancestors was one of the first 147 that came into the Salt Lake Valley. So I have a connection to a lot of that went on early on.
How is the afterlife viewed from the church perspective?
Good question. Probably a lengthy answer. I'll try and give you a quick answer.
3 minutes.
That's a whole other 45-minute discussion.
Yeah.
So we believe quite simply that Earth's life is a point on a spectrum that's eternal, and that we existed as spirits before this life. We came to this earth to receive a body, and the body and the spirit as a resurrected being is a glorified being that will live for eternity. And depending upon how we do in this life, in this period of test, we will be judged and go to different opportunities after this life. So if we've done everything that we needed to do, followed all the commandments, we believe that will allow us to live in an area after this life that would be with our Father in heaven and Jesus Christ. If we don't, it's a little less desirable for what you see.
Less desirable neighborhood. Can you discuss baptism by proxy?
Yes, I can. That's probably maybe our last question. So in the temple, well, baptism I didn't dwell on much, but we believe it to be a fundamental part of the gospel. So to be ultimately to be in that kingdom I described after this life, someone would have to be baptized in order for that to happen. What we do in our temples is we perform ordinances for those on the other side of the veil, as we call it, those that have passed from this life to the other life, who are alive as spirits, will be resurrected with their bodies ultimately, but are in a spirit world after you pass from this life. And so when we do a proxy baptism, it doesn't force that. It just makes that available for someone that lived on this earth and did not have an opportunity to be baptized. They have an opportunity to accept that.
Thank you. Wow, I think you need to come back for part 2. We could get into so many more questions, and I apologize to anyone whose question I didn't get to. You handled a lot of deep questions in a very short amount of time, so thank you. I want to remind everybody that our next meeting will be August 26th at 7 p.m. And we have Greg Elliott, who will be presenting about Buddhism. So that sounds very interesting. I'll be sure to be there. And thank you again, President Stevens, and good night.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.